It is October 28th, 2022, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is Wallace Smith. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. John Robinson. Mr. Robinson, how you doing?
I am doing very well. Ready
good.
for the Sabbath.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. It is a Friday, and I think both of us are ready for the Sabbath. Has been a busy day, but a productive one. I think Mr. Robinson would agree. What are we talking about today? Actually, we have decided, hopefully not lazily, I don't think so, we've decided to make life easy for us. So we've come back from the Feast of Tabernacles. We're pretty much into our normal groove, and we thought, you know what? Why don't we just talk to each other about how our feasts went? Reflect on our feast experiences a bit here with all of you together on the podcast. And Mr. Robinson, you think that's a good idea, right?
I think that's a great idea.
I'm glad you said that because we talked about it beforehand and you said you thought it was a good idea. So.
Well, now I'm not so sure.
Nope, we're committed. That's what we're doing.
Thank you, Jake and Julia, once again. You know, Mr. Smith, when I was at the feast this year, I actually had a few people comment on the jingle that we have, that Jake and Julia did for us.
Oh, on the jingle?
Yeah, very positive. People like it. So thank you again, you guys. And we've enjoyed having it. Kind of a neat little thing to make the podcast sound just a little more professional.
It has been. Actually, I do want to give Jake and Julia full credit because we didn't even know if that was for the demo. We actually had them put this together. That's why it's just Smith and Robinson because we didn't have a title yet.
Yeah.
And we wanted to make sure the demo came across to Mr. Weston, everybody else, as if what it was really going to be like. And we thought, well, you need that kind of professional air. We approached them, and boy, they just grabbed it and did it, and super appreciative. So, anyway, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
We've been gone for a while.
Well, let's see. I ended up being gone almost exactly 2 weeks.
Were you? Okay.
We didn't have to drive nearly as far as you did. We were not ambitious enough to drive all the way across the continental United States.
That is exactly what we did. For those who don't know, well, let's go ahead and highlight first where we went. Where did you go, Mr. Robinson, for the feast?
My wife and I went to Sandusky, Ohio.
Mr. Phil Senna running that, right?
Yes.
Who assisted that? Was that Mr. Long?
Bill Long, yep.
And he, we were there for half of the feast. I think it was last year. And Mr. Senna just always runs a very organized, very, very good feast site.
Well, I'm going to do a little plug for Mr. Senna. If he asks you if you would be a part of his coordinating feast site, say yes. We helped him, I don't remember exactly, 4 out of 5 years or 5 out of 6 years, something like that, down in Texas. Enjoyed all of it. In fact, I would give him a lot of credit for helping me learn to appreciate how serving really does make your feast better by,
You know what, Mr. Robinson? This is a bit of trivia, and you don't know this, but in my office right now, in fact, you were in there, and I was going to show you, and I forgot because I've been saving it. The very first feast I ever coordinated, before I was asked to coordinate it, I wasn't assigned to that. I was actually assigned to assist Mr. Senna because we'd worked informally the year before.
That.
Yeah,
we were there.
Were you really?
Yes.
Well, it was in New Braunfels when
Yep.
I was there at his feast site, but then I was supposed to assist him the next year, and ended up not doing that because they asked me to coordinate Branson the first year. But I met with Mr. Senna in anticipation and preparation for that, and he handed me his organization chart, and you are on that organization chart. And he made comments about you because I didn't know you as well. And I wrote down those comments.
Okay.
So it's literally on my desk because
Wow.
I keep way too much garbage I need to throw away. And there's the org chart with your name on it, and you'll see. And I've written down what Mr. Senna said about you. I tell you,
that's kind of neat.
It's pretty terrible. No, I'm just kidding.
No,
It's not.
I believe it. He's like, if this guy volunteers for your feast site, say no.
That's totally not what he says. But it's always nice to hear positive things behind our back. And so I actually saved that to share it with you before I finally throw it away. This more than a decade old, document I've got. I'll show you that. But anyway, so you went to Sandusky, and we had the privilege of riding out with the DeSimone family, Mr. Mike DeSimone and his family and our family. We left Charlotte, drove all the way to California. So it was across the country. I've never done a trip like that before. We did, we'll talk about some of the experiences in a minute. And then my wife and I spent the first half of the feast. We actually dropped off our family, but spent the first half of the feast in Oregon with Mr. Jonathan Bueno ran the feast site there, was assisted by Mr. Carpenter, did a wonderful job.
Another Texas guy.
And then came down to then California for the San Diego for the second half of the feast. and then drove all the way back to Charlotte. And just marvelous time. Both Mr. Bardot, Mr. Bueno did wonderful jobs with the feast sites, and really appreciate their leadership and the
See, that's another
team
tie
of people
back
they
to
had.
Mr. Senna, because Jonathan Bueno was in Corpus Christi, and
You're right.
Mr.
Senna has just fingerprints.
Everywhere.
But what we thought, our dear listener, those of you actually listening to us chatting with each other, our teens and young adults out there, we hope that you had a good Feast of Tabernacles. I've definitely heard from some of you, and I've heard many positive things. But we thought it would just be fun, relaxing a bit for us. And we haven't talked much. Actually, what you're about to hear is the most that Mr. Robinson and I have talked about our feast experiences. But we thought we would just do like what a lot of you guys do after the feast, is you get together and kind of talk about it and share your experiences and what spiritual lessons came out, and maybe what fun you had, or if it applies, what challenges you might have had. So we were going to do that, and I don't know, you want to kick it off? Want me to kick it off, Mr. Robinson? I could kick it off if you want, or what do you think?
So it's kickoff time?
It's kickoff time.
I don't know if this is the proper kickoff, but I'm glancing at your notes, okay? And
yes.
I see some of what you wanted to cover.
Okay, good.
And I just see Mr. DeSimone's name and some words, and my brain at a glance read it as attempts to fix the world's problems. I was like, yep, that sounds like Mr. DeSimone. He is ready to tackle.
To fix the world's problems. Then I will go ahead and start about that, so we know he's not filled with delusions of grandeur. One of the things I appreciated about the feast that I really enjoyed was Mr. Mike DeSimone's sermon in California, where he talked about the kind of problems the world has. But it wasn't just that, because it was a feast sermon. It was also how mankind tries to fix those problems versus contrasting that with how God is going to solve them. Because the millennium, these problems will be solved. And it was a number of problems, but it really stood out. He focused, for instance, there was a particular article. No, it wasn't an article. It was a documentary he saw, I think. But it was about the giant opioid crisis that the country is going through, and really the world. I know someone who wrote an article about that for the magazine, and he talks about the world's attempts, and he mentions some of the ones we mentioned in the article and some others, but he also talked about comments from an individual who was addicted and his struggles, and how it frustrates him when he just hears people saying, "Oh, why don't you just stop?" Because he said, "Look, I felt like I had one decision and it was a long time ago, and now I feel trapped." I mean, he clearly needs more, but talking about how the world's attempts to address this with this person just make things worse, and make things worse for the world, versus Jesus Christ coming and is going to bring real solutions that the world doesn't seem smart enough to figure out, solutions that involve God's law that the world doesn't want to use, and also, of course, with divine power, be able to enact some of those solutions. And I just thought it was one of those sermons that I appreciate when you hear it at the feast, that is very grounded in reality, but helps you recognize how the solutions to what the world, to the world's dilemmas, really is divine. It really is what only Jesus Christ is going to be able to bring. So I just want to give a little shout out there to Mr. DeSimone. I thought he did a fantastic job, though I was disappointed afterwards, because I was standing near him when someone came up in California to tell him how much they really appreciated that sermon. But then they said, "But I hope you don't mind, but I want to say your first sermon this feast was one of my favorites. You just did wonderful." And I thought, well, that's the one I didn't get to hear. I have no idea what that sermon was about. So I got to hear his worst of the two of the two sermons, but it really was very good. And I thought it was the kind of thing I like to hear at the feast, how Jesus Christ really is the solution the world needs.
Well, if you thought that one, the one you heard was good, then I can only imagine what the first one.
Exactly. So there was one of my memories.
Well, so one of my memories, and it's actually podcast related, believe it or not.
Really?
We arrived at the feast. So as I said, it was in Sandusky, Ohio, and it's in this place called the Kalahari, and it is a gigantic water park. A portion of it is a water park. Like, we did not have services in a water park, just to clarify.
Your hotel room was not in a flume.
But they clearly can service a lot of people there, because there are a million rooms and the hallways are amazingly long. But then they have even further down a large convention area. But what I was going to say is I ran into a lady by the name of Kim Brown.
Okay.
And she had said hi to us, and we clearly looked like we were church members because we were carrying suits and things like that. Well, I ran into her again the next day, and we were talking to her, and I can't remember how my name came up, whether she asked or we said who it was, and she says, "Oh, John Robinson." She goes, "I recognize your voice. It's the voice from the podcast."
Oh, really?
And it was like it was kind of a watershed moment for me to have somebody in the wild, as it were, recognize my voice from the podcast.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
That was kind of a neat moment. So hello to Kim Brown and her son out there. We enjoyed visiting with you a little bit and sharing the feast with you there. But that was my first observation of the feast. Not observation, but my first interesting interaction that I had.
Yeah. That would be really encouraging.
As I mentioned, I had several people mention the podcast, and we're very positive about it. So we appreciate getting the feedback out there. If you want to send us negative feedback, send it to the email. We're podcast@livingyouth.org, right?
Yes, podcast@livingyouth.org. That is correct. And I also by the way, I should add, Mr. Robinson has gotten us some new microphones. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. He was actually telling me earlier how, because he had suggested, he does good research, and he'd suggested some microphones for the podcast. And I completely dismissed what he said, and we did something else. And he was talking about how, I appreciate his patience, and anyway, but these do seem to be better. I've noticed, hopefully y'all are hearing something different, because I'm watching the waveform here. We just record this on GarageBand. Apple gives us no money, just so you know. I'm letting you know. We use pretty basic equipment. And you may have noticed in podcasts in the past, you'll hear this loud noise. It's because we're right next to a major door into and out of the building here in Charlotte, because we're not recording in a fancy studio. Hopefully, we might in the future record someplace in the TV studio, but right now we're just Mr. Robinson's office. And it would always show up, but I just want Mr. Robinson to know I'm not really seeing any big waveforms when that big door closes. So hopefully you guys listening are hearing it.
One of the things we were a little disappointed with in our earlier microphones is they actually kind of had a wide range on them. And I could see there could be instances where that would be helpful, but for our podcasting, what we're trying to accomplish, the wide was problematic, the wide range. So these are much more directional. So that is good.
Oh, it is. So one thing I was going to mention also, and I don't want to just talk about the sermons. People always say, what was the best thing? Well, I don't say always say, but often say one of the best things about the feast was the messages. And so I could go on and on about the messages. And I want to highlight to anyone who may have given messages at the feast, just because we don't mention yours doesn't mean it wasn't wonderful. But we don't want to just rehash all the messages we heard. But I do want to at least mention one other one, and that was actually Mr. Jonathan Buenos. He gave a sermon the first half when we were there in Oregon. I also want to say Portland, Oregon, because I think that I'm just so used to saying the word Portland before the word Oregon. But in Florence, Oregon, which was a beautiful feast site, by the way, we really enjoyed it. It was interesting, and it was about the crucial role of judges when it comes to the law of God. His theme was that we are going to be judges, of course. It's not just you give the people a law and that's it. No, you give them the law, but then you have to work with them and you have to judge circumstances. And there are things that are complicated, even with the law sometimes. And it takes judges to sort those things out and to be able to make authoritative decisions. And he was highlighting to us that we will be able to be that for people in the millennium. That's our goal. That's what we want to be. And so we're learning to discern and submit and understand God's law now. But in the context, and I appreciated that he said this, because I've tried to communicate the same thing, but I'm not sure I did it as well as he did, is that the law, God always intended the law to have administrators, to have judges. And that includes even today. If you look in the past, in ancient Israel, you look in the early church, there were the apostles and there's the ministry. And that would include even now. God doesn't just give all of the members the law, and then we all just make a bunch of individual decisions when difficulties come up. That includes even now. And so we are learning in that context, not only getting to judge personally in our lives, but also between each other, submit to other judges who are not us. And I really like how he made that clear, that the law is not a one and done. You give it to people and then each individual just does all these things. There's always this role where there has to be someone in authority to make decisions and to judge between controversial and difficult circumstances. And that we're going to do that in the millennium. So one thing I liked about that, because I really like in the feast when we're able to focus on the future condition of things. That's why we're there, to celebrate the millennium and to think about it and meditate about that. And not just the millennium. We'll maybe talk about some of that in a minute. But if the feast doesn't make a difference in our current lives, then what is it there for?
Right.
God is hoping that we will come away from the feast different, that we're closer to Him, we're moving closer to our goal, we're more solid in our vision, we're more tied to what Christ is doing in us and what the law is. So yeah, it should make a difference, and I like that His had that kind of, it was about the future, but it had a here and now edge to it, and I really appreciated that.
Well, one of the themes over the last couple years, the issue of government never goes away completely in the church, right? And it comes and goes. But something that really came through to me in the last couple years was how really government, and especially in the context of what you're talking about being judges, what does government really do? Well, it makes decisions and makes judgments on certain things.
Right.
And we should view that as a blessing, especially when there's excellent leadership, because not everybody agrees on everything. We don't see everything eye to eye, and issues can be complex and multi-layered. Isn't it kind of nice to have somebody you can go to that you have faith in, that can make a judgment or a ruling, and even if you don't entirely agree with it, it doesn't matter. It's settled, and and it brings peace to the group.
Right.
Government brings peace to a group by virtue of, hey, that we've all agreed to abide by the decisions made by this person. And so, of course, in the millennium, that's going to be Christ. I mean, we read a couple of the millennial scriptures about the nations going up to the mountain of the Lord and learning what they need to learn and being judged and getting judgment. So I agree with that. Okay, I do have a. So this is actually a bit of a shame story. So this is just for you, Mr. Smith.
No one else is listening.
Do not share this with anybody else.
All right.
So this was the first year my wife and I went to the feast without our daughters. So Maddie's 22, Ella's 18.
Right. And that's not the shame part. That was great that they had that opportunity.
It was great. Well, if I may for a moment, my daughter Madeline, she organized a trip to France. They went to France. So It wasn't just that they went to the feast somewhere else. It was that the feast was in a country that doesn't speak English.
A different continent.
Continent. And we have a family, have been several times. And so she felt experienced enough to handle it, and she's a good planner. And since she actually returned from the feast in France, I'm going to conclude that as successful. But I was proud of her they went with some other friends, and man, she had a good plan, and things didn't go perfectly because they don't when you travel internationally.
Right.
But that she tackled that. So Mom was a little concerned the whole time, but Dad knew, you got to let go at a certain point, and the kids are ready for the new challenge. And so for me, it was more, was proud to see that the kids moved on to it, leveling up, if you will, in life. So we're by ourselves. We're going to Sandusky, which is not a large site, nor, I don't think this is controversial, not considered a terribly exotic site. But by the way, I thought it was a fantastic site. It's not going to be a site next year, and my only point in saying that was I was actually disappointed. I thought it was a good site for going to the feast.
We enjoyed our half feast there. It was really nice.
But especially because the Kalahari can feel a little bit rural, even though it's really not that far from the city. But even then, you're a ways away from a larger city. And so what I found in reviewing my feast was that in part because my daughters weren't there and there weren't a bunch of activities and there weren't other distractions, that I actually was at the feast, if you understand what I'm saying. I was just at the feast. I wasn't half on vacation. I wasn't at the beach. I wasn't at the mountains. I was at the feast. And I don't know why I haven't worked harder in the past to make sure I'm really feast focused when I'm at the feast, because I'm not always. And and I think Mr. Wesson recently talked about how it over time it became, where are you going from the feast, and then the destination almost became more interesting to everybody than in the past. Like, my understanding is the feast was just where it was. It wasn't necessarily somewhere where a lot of people wanted to go. Not by design, it's just how it worked out. And so it was one of my more fulfilling feasts in a while, because my attention was primarily on being at the feast, listening to the messages, thinking about things, talking with my wife about it, talking with our friends about it, catching up with Mr. Senna. And so my one of my takeaways: when you go to the feast, be at the feast, because we're not always. And I learned I don't know, I learned the lesson more deeply. Perhaps that's the best way of putting it.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. I feel bad because I'm definitely going to talk about experiences, the mountains, the beaches, but that was something I want to give some of my family credit for. We in a sense were the opposite of, in terms of breaking apart. We didn't think we'd all be at the same feast site this year. Definitely, I like to say the Smith boys, but at this point they're the Smith men.
And they are the Smith men.
So I there was a good possibility we would be at different sites. It just so happened we were all at the same site. That worked out really well. Mainly because I know one of them wasn't able to go to the feast site that he wanted. He was denied because they were full. So he was going to be coming with us, which was great. So it was all of us together. And given their ages, we kind of anticipate this might have been the last hurrah in that sense, where maybe you still have feasts together, but they're a little more random. You're going to have to actually kind of plan them, versus this was all of us together. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we traveled with the DeSimones, with the whole DeSimone family. So all of us and all of them traveling. I did look at the odometer on our car afterwards and note the beginning and end. And from our driveway there and then back was slightly more than 6,200 miles, wow. which was great. That's, I think that's the radius of the earth. I'm not sure. Like maybe we've driven to the center of the
Imagine
earth.
What the Apostle Paul could have done with a fleet vehicle.
Oh yeah, I bet he would have loved that. Of course, finding gas would have been difficult. Well, he's in the Middle East, probably a lot of gas. Yeah. So anyway, one of the broader takeaways, and I'll mention some of the things we experienced together in a moment, but our experiences were magnified by having the DeSimone family with us. Don't get me wrong, it's wonderful to experience things with your family. And if, let's just say, for some reason the DeSimones had not been on that trip, we still would have enjoyed every bit of it. I mean, it would have been a good feast. But all the more, the idea, our joy was truly multiplied for having them along there too. And it caused me to reflect on the time to come, actually, we mentioned Jake and Julia in the intro music. It was actually Julia who said some time ago, mentioned to me, I don't think I got it secondhand, that she remembers a time when Mr. Tyler, Rob Tyler, was visiting from Australasia and happened to be at her apartment with some other people, and they were fellowshipping, and he had a plane to catch, but he didn't, so you're talking, but the time was coming, he's going to have to leave. So the fellowship was so wonderful, but it was tinged with an edge of sadness because it's got to come to an end, eventually. And she highlighted that one of her observations at that time was that, well, you know what? Our future won't be like that. It'll be like the fellowship never ends, and that wonderful feeling of being together. Well, I've ever since I heard her say that, I've really reflected on that, and I appreciate that. But this added another dimension to it because the things we experience, I'll just mention one right now. For instance, we saw the Grand Canyon. We stopped for atonement in, we stopped the night before. We didn't actually drive over atonement. We stopped and picked up my son at the airport and spent the night in Flagstaff, and then went to Phoenix for atonement. And then the plan was we would see the Grand Canyon the next day before we finished the trip to California. And so we did get to see the Grand Canyon. And guess what? It's really big. It's very grand, the Grand Canyon. And as much as we enjoyed it, and not just it, but the other things that I'll mention a little bit later if we continue in the podcast in that vein, is that our joy of those things was magnified for knowing we're sharing it with our friends. And it made me add to Julia's earlier observation, thinking that that's going to be part of the joy in the resurrection and the millennium. It's not just going to be enjoying the life of being in the existence of the God family and doing these amazing things, but seeing the people we love enjoy the very same things, and seeing them get to experience their joys in the beautiful glorification and the glorified existence that we're going to have as children of God. That is going to magnify our joy. That is going to be an external source of joy, an additional source of joy that magnifies the joy we're already having. And it really added in that sense to my picture of what God is holding out for us and how much more it's going to mean to us to be enjoying eternity with the people we love and getting to experience those things with them. So it ended up, it made for a better physical experience in terms of just, human life and experiencing these things, but it really did also add to my sense of the spiritual picture. And I appreciated that this feast.
Yes, no, that's a great lesson. I mean, I know I don't have much to add to that. I know this is not an original take by any means, but you can do something fun individually, but nearly everything is much more fun doing it with a friend or a family or your spouse or whatever. Doing it with somebody you love makes the activity that was fun far more enjoyable. The shared experience thing is would be difficult to explain in scientific terms, but it's real.
It is. There was a fun moment at a Starbucks. Again, we're not pitching for Starbucks, nor am I endorsing them. Mr. Weston would say, "Oh, you go to that communist loving coffee place, So point well taken. But yeah, we did stop at a few coffee stops here and there, and it was funny. There was one I came up behind Mr. DeSimone, and he and his wife were standing there, and he kind of had his hand just real lovingly on her back. There, it was just what I do with my wife all the time. Couldn't help myself, so I kind of snuck up next to him, put my hand on his back, in the same way, and he's like, "Whoa, what happened?" And that was a lot of fun. And then we went to the San Diego Zoo, and it was so funny because he and I were talking about coffee. These are coffee adventures. We want to get in and get some coffee. And so we got there. We must have spent, I don't know, it felt like the first third of our time just standing to get coffee at the zoo. So that became kind of a joke. It's like, hey, let's go check out the coffee at, whatever, or the coffee at the zoo. And, these little internal jokes like that for your experience. But yeah, they start to pile up and they just made for great memories. So.
I have one other thing that stood out to me at the feast. And it's so interesting to me that it did, because it was a spontaneous comment by somebody. And then we can get into your final point, which you and I had a very similar extrapolation from the feast, your final point when we get to it. But the Bibb family was there in Sandusky, and we got to spend a little time with Mr. Keith Bibb and his wife Sharon and their two sons Kenneth and Kevin, and we got to have a meal with them. But he was the song leader, and I actually wish I could remember what we had just listened to that prompted him to say this. But as the song leader, he spontaneously said something along the lines of, don't question why you were called, just embrace it. And that really resonated with me, because he's exactly right. You can get caught. I don't think his implication was you would never ponder, well, why did God call me? I mean, that's just a natural thing to ask yourself. But don't spend too much time trying to figure out why in some sense, and just focus on the idea that you have been called, and embrace it and lean into it and do your best. I mean, there's an individual whose name I won't mention, but he has the idea of, imagine what you could do if you just single-mindedly focused all your abilities on it. Like, what could you accomplish if you kind of single-mindedly focused on something? And I think about that all the time, and then it always makes me feel kind of bad, because I feel like, well, I could work much harder in my spiritual life and get more things done. But I don't know. That was one of the things that stood out to me, was that's exactly right. We've been called. You can think about it some, but more importantly, embrace that calling and maximize it. And because it kind of leads into the other point. It is a glorious calling that we've been given. And the older I get, this year in particular, I don't know why it's just been resonating with me so much, but it's getting more real to me what God is offering, and like that we underestimate, because that was one of Mr. Phil Senna's sermon topics was, eye has not seen nor ear heard, the wonders that God has awaiting for us. As marvelous as what we've already been told is, that's still out there, and the calling is magnificent. And when what we know, it's like, wow, that's beyond what most people could ever dream of, let alone that there's more to it. And so that I was been thinking a lot about our calling, what God's offering to us, and like you said, there's going to come a time where we aren't running out of time and have to catch a plane, and that we will be with our loved ones for eternity.
Right. That was the one thing we did mention ahead of time, in terms of, it was interesting that our big takeaways were very similar. I know for myself, part of what I enjoyed about this feast was the additional exposure my family and I had to certain natural features of God's creation. I mentioned the Grand Canyon earlier, And it was interesting. It was we had a number of other experiences like massive sand dunes in California. We were I think it was we were definitely still in California. We had seen them driving into California for a brief stretch. There was a brief stretch where you could actually access them, but we just certainly didn't have the time to stop. But on coming out of California, we did. And I've seen dunes at beaches, whether it's Corpus Christi or even larger beaches, but these were massive. They're like small mountains, like small hills at least, the big hills rather, that were sand, and it was just amazing. You hope to get to the top of one and see this massive wasteland of hills in front of you, and it got to the top one and you just saw a bigger one. And I know Mr. DeSimone and at least the boys, I said, okay, forget it, I'm stopping here. But they actually went up to the next one, and sure enough, there was a bigger one there. So they never really got to that point where they could see the whole vast field of sand. We looked at it on Google Earth. It was pretty big. And I remember as I went up, I actually couldn't help myself. I played some of the Hans Zimmer Dune soundtrack. I had to put my phone in my pocket because I knew just the selection of music that I thought would go well, and I thought it was fun to climb this dune with the soundtrack. But that said, and by the way, I'm not endorsing the movie. I don't endorse movies here on the podcast. I'm just mentioning the soundtrack is actually pretty.
Hans Zimmer knows how to score a
movie. He definitely, I don't know if it's too late or if that's all done or if he'll get an Oscar for this, but it was actually one of the most interesting soundtracks that if you look at the process they made to make that. But there's something about not always large, but definitely when it is large, certain natural things that can inspire awe. And there was a sense of awe at this large dune. But then we booked a place for the trip back. On our way back, we knew we'd have to stay in Arizona, so we looked for a place. And there was a place that boasted really good dark nights. And when we got there, and also an observatory, when we got there, the night wasn't quite as dark. It was a little closer to Tucson than you would think. And also the observatory wasn't available because you had to schedule something with an astronomer first, which we did not see in their literature, but that's fine. It all worked out really well. So you could tell Mr. DeSimone was itching for it, and me too. So he hatched a plan to just drive further out into the dark, not to be unsafe, but to get further away from Tucson. So we must have drove another extra 30 to 45 minutes. And I do talk about this in a sermon that will probably get distributed here in the future, but I don't think I'm spoiling it here. And it was much darker out there, and we got to a place where there were barely any lights, and it wasn't all of our party, but it was a lot of us. And that was really, for me, growing up as a suburb boy, and close to cities almost my whole life, it was one of the darkest nights I've ever seen, and you could visibly see the Milky Way, and it was amazing. And Miss Emily DeSimone, some of you listeners might know her from teen camp. She was there at teen camp. They actually brought, like, she and her sister had, I think, a blanket or sleeping bag to lay back on so you could actually look up. And Miss Emily DeSimone said, "Oh, Mr. Smith, we're looking at our inheritance." She was tying it into the sermon I gave last great day. And yeah, that's exactly right. The atheists will say, "Why is the universe so large? If humanity is what's important, what a waste. God's wasteful." No, he wants us to know he's gonna give us all of this. But even then, our inheritance, our future, our eternity is so much greater than just even the things you can imagine, what you might do with planets or what you might do with music. That's part of, and you said something that made me think this thought. Whatever it is we can imagine our future might be, how amazing it might be, how stunning, what eternity is going to be like, what we are guaranteed is it's not going to be worse than that. That's like it's going to be that or better. We are never going to be disappointed. We're never going to outthink what God has in store for us and then get resurrected and then think 4 billion years in, well, okay, this is fine. No, it's going to be something joyous and amazing. And that was my takeaway, which is very similar to yours. I like the way you mentioned the word real, that what God holds out for us was more real for you, perhaps, this feast. And I would have to chime in. I feel like I want to add something new, but real is actually the ingredient that I needed in describing it, because the magnitude of what God offers us seemed larger to me this year. It sank in more just how large in scope and how astonishing in terms of joy and satisfaction and what that eternity is going to be like. But real is actually the word that I'm kind of reaching for. I do feel this feast, God helped me to make the purpose of my salvation a bit more real for me personally. And when you do realize that, that was the point we had talked about a certain one making in a different context, which was that when you really grasp what God is holding out to you, that should radically change your life. When you realize this is what the Creator is holding out for you, you can't help but want to do something about that, to change. You're going to respond. And so the reality of what He holds out to you really has a direct impact on the degree to which you commit to the life that He's asking you to live.
Well, it's this dovetails with a realization I had some years ago, which is I kind of always wonder how like God judged us. And Mr. O'Gwyn would talk about, well, most people think of like this courtroom setting and a judge, and you're like your life is evaluated. God doesn't need that. He can tell by just watching what you do. If you believe something and something is real to you, you act on it. Like it will become obvious. It will transform the way you live your life. And so it's not difficult, from what I can tell, for God to ascertain whether you believe Him or not, because you will order your life around His teachings and His laws and His judgments and His statutes, and it will affect the way you are a spouse, or, a husband or a wife. It'll affect how you raise your kids. It'll affect how you interact with your coworkers and your neighbors. And God can look at you very, very simply. I would argue that on some level, you don't even have to be God. Other people could observe by the way you live your life that you believe in something and you've organized your life around it. So,
yeah, that was my wife's response. We were reflecting Friday night, thinking about Emily. Sorry, we can't help ourselves. You heard Mr. Robinson laughing. You can't see. This is a bad time for this to happen because the microphones are so much better. We were saying earlier that we're next to this giant door that's constantly opening and closing, and we were commenting how the microphones make it harder to hear it, which we're hoping you're not hearing this. But it's like there's a door party going on right next to us.
It sounds like a football team.
It sounds like we've just said, hey, let's make the marching band go through that door. It's about as loud as it's ever been. So hopefully you guys are not hearing it. And if so, kudos to Mr. Robinson for picking these microphones, and shame on me for not listening to you earlier.
Here we are contemplating the deep things of God, and I can't maintain my composure.
I've got a mental picture of someone at the door opening and closing it, opening and closing it.
That is what it sounds like.
It is what it sounds like. Okay, so I will get my wife's observation out there. We were reflecting on Miss Emily D. Simone's comment about, Mr. Smith, we're looking at our inheritance, right? And my wife had commented Friday night. She said, if we really believed that, how differently would we live our lives? And I ended up, using that as kind of the core thought of the sermon that I ended up giving the next day. And it still impacts me thinking about it, that yes, okay, that became real to me. Then how should I live differently? And it's easy to think, if you're out there and if you're baptized or not baptized, but you might understand, well, yeah, isn't that the whole point of what we talk about in the church, that, live your life differently because this is what God is calling you to, and He forgives your sins so you can live differently. But, Mr. Robinson and I are here in our 50 plus years at least. I'm 5'2", 52, that you start, things sink in differently as the years go by. Yeah. And what it's really worth it to you who are teens and young adults to not have to wait for it to be real until 50 or so. To a certain extent, you have to accumulate some experience that gives you perspective. But at the same time, I think if I could encourage you to do anything, it's to go out and try to get a vision of that earlier, what you can. Talk to your parents, talk to those who are living the life and how they see it. And by the time you're my age, you can see it that much more deeply than I do now, because it's worth seeing it, because it, just like 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 through 3 says at the end of that, he says, that those who have this hope in them purify themselves, because to the extent that hope is living in you, to that extent you want to be a different person.
Yes. And and I'll echo your sentiments there with the youth, because what I find is also something that will bolster your understanding and belief in our profound inheritance that awaits us if you follow through and do what you need to do. It is live a godly life as closely as you possibly can, because that's how you see how it works. I mean, now here I am at 51, and you and I are surprisingly similar on some of the things we've taken note of in the last couple of years. And it's from living, it's imperfectly living a way of life that's prescribed by God through the Bible. And because you see that it works, and then but you also see other people who decide to do it a different way, and it doesn't work. So it's more than just that it worked for you. You see the other ways don't work, and so stick with it. Even if you wonder, well, why does God do it this way? Just believe that if you do it that way, it will work, and then you won't be left in mystery for the rest of your life. Eventually, you will go, okay, I get it now. There are just some things that you can only learn by being all in and persevering, sticking to it, and then you walk away and go, oh, well, I didn't understand that when I was younger, but now I know why God has structured it the way He has.
Right. Give it time. It's just like your parents not always making sense when you're young, but the older you get, they start to make more sense why they did. And then next thing you know, you're their age, and you look back, and so many of their decisions totally make sense that were just crazy too when you're younger. And it's definitely the same thing with God's way. I do find that, since it sounds like we're wrapping up, I do find it really interesting that Mr. Robinson and I went off in different places, and yet we came back with very similar takeaways in terms of our salvation and the impact that should have in our lives.
So, and along those lines, and this is entirely subjective, I could present no evidence for this, but I really did feel like, there was when I say a real unity, what I mean is like other people felt similarly. We did have an older group in Sandusky. There weren't a lot of younger people, but I really felt like there was a sense amongst those at the feast this year that, wow, feels like things are getting close. And I don't know. It's just it was a good feeling, and we had a great feast. And thank you to Mr. Senna and everybody who Mr. and Bill Long put in a lot of effort putting a feast side on. I know what that's like. It's a lot of work goes into it, and then people like me just show up and enjoy the feast.
Yeah, and my thanks also to those who were a part of the feast in Oregon and California. My wife and I, and my family and I, just had an absolutely wonderful time, and it was enriching. And it's easy to be sad at the end of the feast, but I don't know about you, Mr. Robinson. At the end of this feast, I was fired up. I was ready to come back and let's do it. Let's get it done.
You're right, because sometimes you do. I have found that I come back from the feast and kind of feel like, oh man, I need a break, and it's like we were just at the feast. But I agree. I felt that's a great way of putting it. I did feel recharged, which is what the feast ought to be, an annual renewing, and get us ready for the next year. Yep.
All right. Well, that's our report from the feast. We would like to invite you and remind you that our email does work, and many of you, increasingly numbers, are sending us comments on our email at podcast@livingyouth.org. We'd like to encourage you, feel free and send, some Bible questions, send some topics suggestions. We've definitely gotten some suggestions for topics from from teens out there and from young adults. And also for those of you who bothered to come up to Mr. Robinson and bothered to come up to me and to tell us that you appreciate the podcast, thank you for taking the time to encourage us. That really, it really does make a difference, and we hope you find these helpful. And that's it. Hope you had a wonderful feast. Mr. Robinson and I did, and we look forward to kicking off. It's not exactly a new season. I mean, I don't really know. I need to, because you have to tell Spotify when you have a new season. You tell it what season it is. So I don't know when we ought to call a new season or something. Maybe we should go feast to feast. What do you think, Mr. Robinson?
I think that makes a lot of sense.
All right, we're going to do that. So tell you what, we're officially calling it. The next podcast will be the first podcast of season 2. Thank you guys out there for hanging out with us, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Smith and Robinson.